The whole theme of this section is now the imposition of liberalism domestically, as far as our own Canadian experience. The music is a First Nations song. Um, the this meme or poster is kind of poking fun at U.S. Homeland Security. That the original Homeland Security um, we're actually the First Nations. So we're going to be looking at the imposition of liberalism, how successful slash unsuccessful it's been in our own Canadian experience. We'll start off with a couple of clips. There was that music, and now the subsequent video clip here in a minute. This comes from the official document, the Indian Act of 1876, which you have learned about quite extensively in Social 9, a little bit in Social 10, certainly in Social 11, and to the extent in Social 12, where we're looking how unsuccessful this imposition has been throughout history. Here's a little clip from a documentary series called The Eighth Fire. The commentator is a First Nations personality by the name of Wab Canoe, I believe. Here he is.
So what went wrong? It wasn't always like this when we started down the path. When the settlers first arrived, the natives welcomed them and helped them out. It wasn't like they showed up and the natives said, uh-oh, there goes the neighborhood. And the relationship grew stronger, fashionable even. Remember these? It's a beaver hat. This was considered cool back in the day. That's right, our rodents were all the rage in 17th century Europe. That led to the fur trade, and of course the fur trade gave us Canada. For a time, the Aboriginal people had this warm and fuzzy feeling, love and understanding. We documented that in wampum belts like this one that depict two canoes traveling down the river in parallel paths, neither one interfering with the other. It's cute, eh? And the English and French, well, for their part, they signed all sorts of big agreements with great seals. Ever since the Royal Proclamation of 1763, there's been banner promises like, the natives will not be molested. Or my personal favorite, the Queen's promise to the Cree of bounty and benevolence. You know, we Aboriginal people thought we were getting a seat at the big table. But it turns out we had a reservation at a much smaller table, out the back, near the garbage cans. At the big table, they got Canada and all of its bounty. At our table, a total lack of benevolence. We got the plague, a plague of whiskey, and our parents and grandparents were molested in schools designed to kill the Indian in the child. So where did all of that go wrong? Well, step into my office, grab a seat on the big couch, and let's talk.
All right, so this term imposing liberalism, I mentioned a little bit in the previous video lesson, means forcing something upon people whether they want it or not. Okay, and this is not just imposing chores on your kids, but it could be. Okay, I left the house today. I told my kids they had to do a few chores, but imposing is when you do something to someone else without their choice. Liberalism has been imposed on people at various points in history, sometimes with positive, but also sometimes with negative consequences. The two maps that you see here, Germany, liberalism was imposed on them after World War I with the Weimar Republic. After the Peace of Paris Versailles Treaty, uh, not so successful. A little bit more successful after World War II, okay, but liberalism nonetheless was imposed upon them. Rwanda is an example where the imposition of Western ideologies or beliefs led in some ways to very catastrophic consequences. So, what were the domestic Aboriginal experiences with liberalism? We want to analyze three areas in order to better appreciate the Aboriginal experience. One, their differing worldviews. Okay, we learned about worldviews in Social 10. Two, we're going to learn about the Indian Act. And three, one of the actions that came out of the Indian Act was the institution of residential schools to take the so called Indian out of the Indian, all about assimilation. But we're going to look at those horrific consequences. So, under differing worldviews, which particular principles of liberalism conflict with Aboriginal way of life? The idea of community and collectivism would certainly conflict with more Western viewpoints of individualism and self reliance. Based on this information, what principles of liberalism were actually violated because of the Indian Act? Well, I mean, they were taking lots of choices from the First Nations people. They had to live a certain way. Their children, eventually, with residential schools, were be sent to these places without their consent. Absolute violation of liberalism, absolute violation of choice. All right, so we look at our more modern Canadian Charter rights and freedoms, and we look at all the acts or rights that were violated by the so-called Indian Act. You know, not, I mean, we're looking at some of them: equality rights, democratic rights, your basic fundamental freedoms were violated. You know, property rights. Under residential schools, mobility rights, your fundamental freedoms, your legal rights. This here is a map of the state of New York. And if you remember us talking about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy back in chapter 3, this would be an example of a group of First nations uniting to form a larger entity, a confederacy. And so this was an example from history in which uh, liberalism took some ideas from the First Nations people. Some of these ideas were instituted into the federal principles of the United States government, its constitution, and also our Canadian federal system. In the video, they briefly mentioned the two-row wampum belt that the um, the First Nations people and the European people have different paths, but they're supposedly working together. Okay, it's this separate but equal kind of way of thinking. The spirit of this two wampum belt has not necessarily been carried out. You know, at some point when the Europeans obtained, uh, a superior position in comparison to the First Nations people, they took advantage of that, amalgamated it, combined it, made them stronger. Okay, at the expense of the First Nations people. So, the spirit of this two-row wampum belt was not necessarily carried out. Okay, the European worldview: keep the peace, gain allies, acquire land, resources, private property, the idea of individualism, laissez faire capitalism, competition brings about progress, always looking to change, make yourself better, innovation. And then this whole idea of self interest. You do things for the sake of yourself and the people around you. Whereas the First Nations holistic worldview: peace and harmony, cooperation, uh, traditional territories used for the benefit of the collective, the sharing of land and resources. You had to live in a community. The individual was subservient to the needs of the collective. So, because those worldviews were so different, obviously there was going to be clashes. Relations between early European settlers and Aboriginal peoples were complicated by differing cultural perspectives. Like I had previously mentioned, the First Nations perspective was circular and holistic, whereas the European perspective was mainly hierarchical. You can see how the circular, holistic worldview of the First Nations people, certainly was, all inclusive, whereas the European was a top down way of thinking. To Europeans in the 1700s, treaties with First Nations were intended to keep the peace and to gain allies against other colonial powers fighting for control of North America. This began with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. very significant at the time. It defined Canada's relationship with Aboriginal people and sets out the basis in law for the Aboriginal land ownership and other rights. Aboriginal peoples lived on traditional lands. Interest in those lands belonged to groups and nations, not individuals. Only the British monarch at the time and then later the Canadian government could buy or accept Aboriginal land. Crown generally required an agreement to obtain lands from Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people were under the Crown's protection. So, in other words, in order for things to happen, it had to go through a process. And this agreement was between groups. At the time, it was seen as an agreement between one group of people, the First Nations, versus another group of people, the British. Okay, in much way of a much more even relationship than what was occurring a century or two later. By 1812, however, European settlers now outnumbered First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in the eastern portion of what would be later known as Canada. Colonial governments decided to negotiate treaties across Canada which took over First Nations land in exchange for promises of compensation in form of annual payments and other benefits. Okay. The imposition of liberalism on Canada's First Nations people is reflected in the difference of understandings of the treaties between the governments of Canada and First Nations. The First Nations people believed that these were treaties by people that were equal, whereas the government of Canada, maybe as they became more and more powerful over time, saw them as something that could be changed or reinterpreted or renegotiated because of the difference in power between the two sides. The imposition of the government of Canada's liberal understanding of treaties was compounded by some colonial leaders who did not honor treaties. Well, it just basically boiled down to um, if you can't hold on to a treaty or if there is no way for you to protect the rights found within an agreement, what stops another side from taking advantage of that, from consolidating power over time? They believed that their European liberal ideology was superior to that of the First Nations. In other words, Eurocentrism. They did not consider the First Nations people to be sovereign nations. They did not consider the treaties to be valid nation to nation agreements. In their view, the treaties over time could be altered, did not need to be honored. Many of the values of liberalism conflicted with many of the holistic laws governing First Nations, Metis, and Inuit societies that I had previously mentioned. Resistance by Aboriginal people to these values was not accepted by governments in Canada. This led to the policies of assimilation. Of course, assimilation is a plan to impose obedience to these European liberal goals on all Aboriginal peoples. So, in other words, we are going to make the First Nations people more like the European people. We're going to strip them of their culture. We're going to strip them of their religion, of their customs, of their culture. And then we're going to make them more like European people so that we'll all be able to get along better, work together, etc. Under these policies, Aboriginal people were supposed to give up their distinct cultures and traditions, such as the potlatch and the sundance, and take on the Western culture and traditions. Liberal thought promoted the ideas of individual interest, rights, and freedoms. But in Canada, the collective identity and practices of Aboriginal people were negatively affected by government policies of assimilation. As a result, Aboriginal people did not receive full recognition of their rights or freedoms. So let's look at these specific acts of assimilation. Yes, the Indian Act of 1876 was an act of assimilation. Made rules about the lives of First Nations without consulting them. First Nations were viewed as people who needed guidance, needed assistance, needed to be cultured, needed to be changed. Indian agents, uh, government agents were appointed to run the reserves. The goal of the Indian Act was to assimilate First Nations. Simple. To assimilate, to marginalize, get them out of the way. Banning of traditions and First Nations spiritual ceremonies, like I previously mentioned with the potlatch and the Sundance, and restricted the rights and privileges of First Nations people. The whole design of it was to marginalize and to assimilate. First Nations people were encouraged to leave their Indian status, identity, and traditional cultures to become full citizens of Canada and gain the rights and freedoms that any citizen enjoyed. But it was with a catch. They had to agree to voluntary enfranchisement. First Nations people were viewed as children and to be taken care of by the government, a so called paternalism. This whole idea of enfranchisement is yes, you could become a European like. Yes, you could be a citizen of Canada. Yes, you could gain rights and freedoms, but you had to get rid of your way of doing things, your culture. Eventually, voluntary turned to compulsory enfranchisement. The Indian Act also included many discriminatory amendments that forced enfranchisement on people, such as any Aboriginal person who received a university degree or became a doctor, lawyer, or religious minister was compulsory enfranchised. Aboriginal women who married a non Aboriginal man lost their status. Any Aboriginal that chose to vote lost their status. Any Aboriginal people that joined the armed forces, etc. Okay, and once again, you can see there's lots of links. You can look at those links. Some are good, some are not so good, but nonetheless, it's up to you to check them out. Okay, this was traditional potlatch sharing that was banned by the Europeans. One way in which you can get rid of people's culture is to ban their practices. The aspect of sharing property. If there's something you don't need, you exchange for something you might need, etc. Okay, and this was another example of community getting together, working together. And if you can destroy community, this cohesive kind of nature, another way to marginalize to diminish a First Nations group. A potlatch is a festival ceremony practiced by Indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest coast. It included groups, as you can see here. The word from the Chinook jargon meaning to give away or a gift. It is a vital part of Indigenous culture of the Pacific Northwest. Potlatching was made illegal in 1885 in Canada and the United States in the late 19th century, largely at the urging of missionaries and government agents who considered it worse than useless custom that was seen as wasteful, unproductive, and was not part of a civilized value. Potlatch was a key target in assimilation policies and agendas. Missionary William Duncan wrote in 1875 that the potlatch was by far the most formidable of all obstacles in the way of Indians becoming Christians or even civilized. Another way in which, and probably the most famous or infamous way in which assimilation was pushed through, was the institution of the residential school system. The government felt it had to forcefully bring these children of the First Nations people into Western values and ways of the Europeans and could do so only through education. These policies were carried out through the residential school system. In 1920, the government's goal was to assimilate the First Nations Métis Inuit children into Western culture and traditions and to remove their Aboriginal culture, language, and traditions. Some would argue that it wasn't assimilation, wasn't education, it was actually cultural genocide. The government's stated purpose of residential schools was to kill the Indian in the child. Duncan Campbell Scott, the infamous deputy superintendent of Indian Affairs, believed it was the right of the Canadian government to deal with this group of people. Get rid of them, if by depopulation, but let's assimilate. Okay, make them part of the same way of thinking as the European people. Another video clip. Once again, go ahead and look at that. It'll look at residential schools. All right, so later on in our history, towards the latter part of the 1960s, there was an attempt by the Liberal government of Pierre Trudeau to once again bring First Nations people into the mainstream culture of Canada. And this attempt to bring them in as equal entities within uh, our country was called the White Paper. And essentially, this White Paper, there's a much longer name for this document. Uh, it was an attempt to rid First Nations of their treaty statuses, to make them on par with every other Canadian, etc. Let's have a look at it. In the 1968 federal election, Prime Minister, or soon to be Prime Minister Trudeau, campaigned on a platform of creating a just society, equality, modern liberal principles. His government believed that policy should encourage values of liberalism, where the rights of the individual are more important than the rights of the collective. Trudeau's government then issued, like I said, the name of it was much longer than this, but it's been coined the White Paper, that proposed to get rid of anything that kept the First Nations peoples distinct or different from the rest of Canada. Trudeau believed that a Canadian was a Canadian was a Canadian, and he did not believe in distinctions, in differences. So he believed that all treaties should be abolished. The Department of Indian Affairs would be abolished. It would be ending unique status. And by doing so, they would eventually have to catch up with the other Canadians. Okay. Yes, that was the white paper. So, do you think the First Nations people were happy with this proposal? Once again, I think this is a link to something, but maybe not. I think it is a link. Their response came in the form of the red paper. White paper received a hostile reception from First Nations leaders who saw it as just another attempt to assimilate. In response to the white paper, the leaders of the First Nations Métis Inuit published the Citizen Plus, or Red Paper, which outlined their objections to the proposed changes. Things started to change quite a bit once the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was brought forth in 1982. The rights exclusive to Indians in the Indian Act are beyond legal challenge under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 25 of the Charter, in particular, provides that the Charter shall not be interpreted as negating specific Aboriginal treaties and their corresponding rights and freedoms. Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 82 also recognizes and affirms the legal validity of Aboriginal treaties. So, in other words, the treaties that were signed hundreds of years ago cannot be altered by the Canadian government. And like I said, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was signed in 1982. And this is Prime Minister Trudeau and Queen Elizabeth II signing this document on that in that year. All right, this is a chart that I've shown in Social 9. First Nations people and also the French and English uh, have collective rights in our country. As we learned in Chapter 4 in Social 9, collective rights are rights that are held by people that were foundational in the organization of Canada. So the main groups that have collective rights promoting their group of people would be the French and English, but also the First Nations groups such as the Métis, the First Nations, and the Inuit. All right. Individual rights are rights guaranteed to every individual in Canadian society. Collective rights, rights guaranteed to a specific group in Canadian society for historical. I already talked about that. And like I said, those groups, those five main groups in Canada, have collective rights. All Canadians have individual rights, and even people that are not Canadian citizens have individual rights. All right, this is a source. Once again, the First Nations and the Canadian government's, uh, relationship continue to alter. This was 1990 with the Oka crisis, in which uh, people wanted to develop land on specifically a golf course on First Nations ancient burial grounds. The Mohawks protested against this attempt to desecrate their burial grounds. It led to a number of month standoff between the government of Quebec and then eventually the government of Canada and the Canadian military versus the Mohawk of that region of Oka. Events like Oka eventually led to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People later that decade. Oka occurred in 1990. This commission was commenced in 1996. After 5 years of study, the inquiry was created in the aftermath of the Oka crisis of 1990. The Royal Commission concluded that, and I'm just reading straight from here, that a sweeping change had to be made in the relationship between First Nations and the Canadian government. It also set out a detailed plan to close the economic gap between Aboriginal people and non Aboriginal people by 50% and improve social conditions in the next 20 years. However, halfway through that 20-year goal, and this was a number of years ago, the government has been assigned a failing grade by Canada's Assembly of First Nations. This is another chart that I've shown from grade 9 on, some of the treaty rights that specific areas receive. We, of course, live in the area that is known as Treaty 7. So what this chart is doing is this is what some of the things that they were promised, but ultimately, what did they get? Okay, they were supposed to get health care, education, hunting, fishing rights, reserves, farming assistance, and then annuities, special benefits. Well, in some places they don't get much at all. As you can see, $5. Okay, farming assistance, as long as it didn't compete with the Europeans. Reserves, the Indian agents sold for cheap prices. Education, they got a European education, and healthcare. There was a shortage of nearly $2 billion as of 2007. And so there's some things that were promised, but in actuality, they really didn't get what they were promised. According to the chart, how well do you believe the government of Canada is honoring the terms of the numbered treaties? Well, according to the chart, it doesn't sound like they have been honored that well. So there's lots of contemporary issues. Are the First Nations people, as far as their affluence, success, etc., on par with the rest of Canada? Most people would argue no. There is still a huge gap between their quality of life and that of the rest of Canada. One case study that came out of Ontario was Attawapiskat, okay, and the abject poverty that was in that First Nations reserve. And there's a number of reasons for that. Okay. This specific case study is an isolated First Nations reserve located in northern Ontario near Kenora at the mouth of James Bay. In 2011, the community came under national and international scrutiny due to the appalling conditions within the town. And there are a number of reasons for that. Some of the reasons might be government reasons, and some of the reasons might be their own reasons, the leadership or the lack of funding or the lack of just a number of issues. Okay, that uh, some of those reasons ultimately might stem from, decades earlier. Okay, generational issues. Out of events like Attawapiskat came the Idle No More movement, worldwide indigenous movement started by First Nations tribes of Canada as a way to help protect the constitutional treaty rights of the Ininaks. These rights were being threatened by the proposed House of Commons 45 bill. The bill will significantly decrease tribal leader and community control over decisions related to the land and water use on Indian reserve lands. The tribal peoples of Canada were concerned that they will have little to no control over how corporations make use of untapped natural resources, specifically on Indigenous territory protected under sovereignty treaties. So, getting back to this issue, one of the ways or reasons that was reported that they're in such abject poverty was the money in which they were given by the government of Canada never was sufficiently and properly handed out. There was talk of corruption, there was talk of misuse, etc., from the government perspective. The First Nations perspective would be, well, you're just not giving us enough assistance. You didn't put us in a good enough position to have success. And so the whole talk with Idle No More is that the government's going to say, well, we're going to handle your money more. We're not going to allow you to take that money and divide it up as you see fit. We're going to have more of a central control over that. The First Nations group, you know, charging paternalism once again, were outraged by that threat. Little intermission. All right, I think we're about done. Once again, The Eighth Fire, that was a CBC documentary about the First Nations and their experience, was well made. It was made probably about 6, 7 years ago, but still fairly well made documentary. I think that's it.
You know, we Aboriginal people thought we were getting a seat at the big table. We got the plague, a plague